Well, hello and thank you for joining us for the opening session of our second day of the Land Connection 2021 conference, looking at the role of land and the economy. I'm Posy MacRae and I head up communications at the Scottish Land Commission. And this morning I'll be chatting to Shona Glenn, who is responsible for policy at the Commission. Throughout today, the conference sessions will look at community wealth building, housing and place. So first we'll take a dive into why land is so important to Scotland's economy and our recovery and renewal. But I just need to do a bit of housekeeping first. Helping us in the background with all of the tech is Jess and Sarah, so thanks Jess and Sarah for that. And you may have caught the message at the beginning, but just to point out that this session is being recorded, and that includes the chat section, and we will be publishing the recording on our YouTube channel. And this is our third land reform conference that we've held over the time, and they've developed considerably over time. We would really like your feedback to help us shape our events in the future. So please watch out for a short survey which will be sent to everyone after the webinar. And it'd be great if you could let us know what you think. So in this session, we'll be exploring the role of land, how and why it is vital to the Scottish economy in creating a greener and fairer nation. This will take the form of a discussion for about 20 minutes as I ask some tricky questions to Shona to delve into this. And then we'd like to open up to you for your questions using the Q&A function. This will probably take about 45 minutes in total. So far, we've had people joining our sessions from across Scotland and wider, so please let us know where you're joining from and your interest in the session using the chat box. And please feel free to comment and connect with other attendees over the next 45 minutes. So, Shona leads work at the Commission looking at how we can improve the efficiency and equity of land markets and reform the way land rights and ownership are controlled. Shona is passionate about how we can transform our economy with land at the heart of the economic model. So, Shona, why do things need to change and why does land need to be at the heart of it?
Thanks, Posy. Well, things need to change because our current approach to economics just isn't working very well. It's delivered really high levels of inequality and low productivity, and not to mention a dangerously depleted natural environment. And none of that is compatible with well-being. So it's really easy, I think, to make the case for change on moral grounds, but actually I think that's too easy for some people to ignore. So I think what we really need to be doing is making the case for change on economic grounds. And the economic grounds are actually really strong. GDP is about 8.5% lower today than it should be because of inequality. And unmitigated global warming could reduce average global income by 23% by 2100. So if we care about economic performance at all, then we need to make the economy greener and we need to make it fairer. And I really do believe that land is central to doing that. Because, you know, if you think about it, to create a greener Scotland, what we need to do is we need to reduce the impact of our economic activity, both in terms of carbon emissions and in terms of habitat and biodiversity loss. And whether we do that by planting trees or restoring peat bogs, or by creating district heating networks in 20-minute neighbourhoods, actually land use is going to play a massive role in that. So that's how we go about creating a greener Scotland. To create a fairer Scotland, we need to tackle wealth inequality. Now, around 2/3 of the UK's net worth at the moment are locked up in land, 2/3. So to do that, we need to look at how the benefits of that wealth are shared. So that's going to involve modernising land rights and reforming how land markets operate. Now, all three of those things, land use, land rights and land markets, are what land reform is all about.
Okay. So what's so important about that?
Well, there's a couple of things I think that make land different from sort of other factors of production. The first is, you know, its foundational role. It literally underpins everything else. And it's the basis for all production, you know, the food we eat, the houses we build, absolutely everything. And it's also the physical foundation of place, which we'll maybe come on to talk about in a wee while. But the other important difference, I think, between land and other factors of production is a bit more abstract. And that is the spatial dimension of land. And it's the spatial dimension that the other factors of production just don't have, which mean that to some extent, every piece of land is unique. And what that does is it gives land a sort of scarcity value that man-made capital just doesn't have, because you can't make more of it. You know, it's that old thing about, you know, buy land, they're not making it anymore. And what that means is if demand for land goes up, prices tend to follow. Now, that's important because it makes it possible to generate a return from land simply by owning it, rather than doing anything necessarily useful with it. Now, from an economic perspective, that's really bad, because if you could turn a profit simply by possessing something rather than doing something useful with it, then there's no incentive to innovate. And innovation is ultimately what drives economic progress.
Okay, well, let's explore this a little bit more. Can you give us an example of what that might look like in the real world?
Yeah, yes, I know that's all very theoretical. So real world examples are important. And I think what's happening now in parts of rural Scotland, where global action on climate change seems to be driving increased demand for land, and that's land with carbon sequestration potential, so peat bogs and hill ground and forests. And I think that's a really good example of that, because a peat bog isn't the same as a factory. You know, if you can't just go out and build another one if demand increases. So if there's a big surge in demand for peat bogs, then prices are likely to go up. And if you happen to own that land, then you can do quite well out of that, because not necessarily because of anything you've done, just because the prices have gone up. Now, that's a problem. It's a problem for local communities and individuals who might miss out, who might be priced out of the market and might miss out because of that. But it's also a poor allocation of resources. So it's a problem, it's an economic problem as well. Because if you can make a decent profit just by buying up land and waiting for the value to go up, you're not likely to put a lot of effort into making the best possible use of it.
Okay, so I can see how communities could lose out in that situation, but does that have wider implications for the economy as a whole?
Yeah, I think it does. And I think the implications actually could be quite significant. So the global green investment market has gone from virtually a standing start back in about 2007 to an estimated $754 billion today. Now, Scotland's natural endowments, our land resource, mean that we're particularly well placed to take advantage of that. And that's a huge economic opportunity for us. It potentially as significant as oil, it could be really, really big. And I think if we can secure even a small proportion of that and invest it responsibly, in communities and for the future, then the results could be really transformational, not just for the communities, and living round about the land, but actually for our whole country.
Okay, so what can we do about it then?
Well, we had a whole session on this yesterday, so I'm not going to repeat all that here. Although I think hopefully the recording from that will be on our website shortly. But in a nutshell, what we need to do, I think, is embed the idea that Scotland's natural resources belong to us all, and that we all have the right to benefit from them. And we need to embed that idea firmly into policy and practice. Now, there's going to be different ways of doing that, through regulation, maybe by working with investors and land managers on good practice, possibly through legislation or even taxation. But the overarching point, I think, is that in order to protect the public interest, and to make sure that we really use this opportunity to create a real legacy for the Scottish people, we need to actively manage the land market. We can't just leave it up to market forces and expect to get a good outcome.
Okay, so this idea of not relying on market forces alone, that is something that the Land Commission has talked about before through various different bits of work. So, for example, the recent work on housing as well. So can you talk to us through the links between housing and land and well-being?
Yeah, okay. So for the past sort of 30 or 40 years, Scotland's system of housing delivery has been largely market-led. And that's been reasonably successful in terms of actually delivering houses, but it hasn't been so effective in delivering places. And the reason for that is because the private sector is, quite rightly, focused on maximising shareholder value. And to do that, it tends to focus on areas where it can generate the biggest profits. So that usually means greenfield sites and growth areas. And it means that more rural parts of Scotland and places that perhaps need regeneration tend to lose out. That kind of private delivery model also tends to focus effort on aspects of housing delivery that create private value rather than social value, because those are things that can be easily reflected in the prices that the house builders charge to the customers. So I'm talking about things like luxury kitchens and integral garages, rather than things like green space and good transport links, which are more about sort of public benefit. Now, if we want to change that, then I think we need to take a much more active role in shaping the land market. And that means that the public sector needs to take a much more proactive role in assembling and bringing sites forward for development. So we published some recommendations on this a couple of months ago, and I'm hoping that by some magic, a link will appear to that somewhere in the chat function. And one of my colleagues, David, is going to be doing a fantastic session on this this afternoon at 1:30, I think. So if you're interested in that, I'd really encourage you to sign up to that session.
Okay, thanks, Shona. So, just sort of get my head around it. So what I think you're saying is that the market is good at delivering houses, but not so good at delivering places, sort of where people want to live at prices they can afford. So we then need land reform to help with that. But how does that relate to the idea of well-being?
Yeah, so that's exactly right. The market's good at delivering homes, but not so good at delivering places. And the link between place and well-being is really, really strong. And you can see this intuitively, you know, just by thinking about what happened during lockdown, where if you were lucky enough to live in a nice house in a good neighbourhood with plenty of green space around you, lockdown, you know, really wasn't so bad. But not everybody was that lucky, and a lot of people didn't have much space, didn't have easy access to green space, or maybe were living in pretty dilapidated neighbourhoods where popping out to walk the dog or go for a run just wasn't an option. And for those people, lockdown was a really different experience. But you know, if your intuition isn't enough for you, to I suppose make the link between place and land and well-being for you, actually there's really strong quantitative evidence to support this as well. Each year, about 5,000 more people die in Scotland than you would expect to, based on sort of our socioeconomic indicators alone, 5,000 people. Now, academics refer to this as Scotland's excess mortality. And a lot of people have spent a lot of time trying to figure out why that's the case, you know, crunching the numbers and looking at the reasons. And that all culminated in 2016, I think it was, when academics published a big study of their findings. And what they concluded was one of the factors that explains this is what they described as an adverse physical environment. So, you know, place. So there's absolutely no doubt, you know, quality of place, the quality of the place that we live has a huge effect on well-being. And what our work has shown is that our ability to deliver great places is directly tied up to our approach to land.
Okay, so I can see how an approach that delivered better placemaking would then improve well-being. But is there then a link between that to economic performance as well?
Yeah, you know, there definitely is. And over the past few decades, housing has really become like the defining feature almost of the UK economy. I mean, you know, some people have joked about how the UK doesn't really have an economy. It's got a housing market with an economy attached. And, you know, it's really true if you look at some of what's happened in the last few years. And that's important. You know, that's actually a really sort of pernicious model, because it's not real. Growth isn't based on real improvements in productivity. It's based on house price growth. And because of that, it tends to be characterised by really quite dramatic booms and slumps. And, you know, as somebody who lived through the 2008 crisis, I can personally attest that that's really, really bad for well-being. Now, we think that the proposals we've made to government could help to change that. It's not going to be the whole solution, but we think it can help. And the way we think it can help is by improving the availability of development-ready sites, which we think would make housing supply more responsive to demand, which is a key aspect of macroeconomic stability.
Okay, so is there any reason why some people may be worried about this direction of travel, this move to more of a well-being economy?
Well, no, I don't think it should be, because, you know, if we're all focused on well-being. But I think the reason that some people get alarmed by this kind of stuff, this kind of talk, is that they imagine that what we're talking about is some kind of state takeover, where the government, you know, comes in and tries to take over what the private sector is doing. But that's not what we're saying at all. The private sector is an important part of the system, and it's going to remain an important part of the system. But for it to do its job properly, the public sector also needs to be playing a much more active role at the front end of the system. Now, what we're talking about here is enabling the state, I think, to play that role by elevating it above the status of regulator, which is kind of where it's been at for quite a long time, I think. And what we want to do is elevate that role to something much more proactive that actually drives the economy forward. And, you know, if people are still worried about that idea, it might be reassuring to know that it's not just us who are thinking like this. There's actually a whole range of eminent thinkers saying similar things at the moment. You know, people like Mariana Mazzucato and her idea of a mission-led economy. And that's all about, you know, this idea that government should actively shape markets rather than just being carried along with them. You know, actively shape markets to meet challenges like climate change, and to do that by working in partnership with the private sector to encourage innovation, to encourage risk taking for the sake of society as a whole.
You sort of mentioned earlier that rising inequality has definitely been highlighted over the last 18 months due to the pandemic, but inequality has actually been increasing over a number of years now, and that's been a big theme of the Commission's work, is looking at how to reduce that inequality. So why do you think it is increasing, and what's the link between inequality and land?
Yeah, okay. So I think wealth inequality is probably the big challenge for economics at the moment. After falling for much of the first half of the 20th century, inequality started increasing again around 1980, and it's now back at around about the same place it was at the eve of World War I. So, that's pretty dramatic, and it's obviously really bad for well-being. But I think what's interesting about it is it's not just a cyclical phenomenon, it's actually baked into the system. And we know that because of some really important work that's been done in recent years by people like Thomas Piketty and others. And what that work has shown is that it's not a cyclical phenomenon, it's baked into the system, because the dynamics of the capitalist system mean that wealth tends to accumulate over time. And the reason for that is quite simple. Money goes to money. And if you've got some, it's relatively easy to get more. But if you don't, it's almost impossible to catch up. Now, the implication of that is that you need some kind of public policy response to address that at a structural level, or things are just going to get worse. And the reason that the Land Commission is so interested in this is that a huge component of wealth in the UK at the moment is made up of land. It accounts for almost 2/3 of UK net worth and about 1/3 of household wealth. So if we want to tackle inequality, we absolutely have to look at land.
So with land being a big component of wealth, how do you think we can get it working better for everybody?
Well, there's a few things we could do. We could start by not wasting it. And Scotland currently has about 30,000 hectares of vacant and derelict land, and that's a massive resource, and it's literally sitting there doing nothing. So if we were to bring that resource back into use, we could be making much better use of our shared wealth. The Land Commission's done a huge amount of work on this over the past couple of years, culminating in the publication of recommendations from the Vacant and Derelict Land Task Force last year. And I'm hoping that somebody will magically post a link to that up in the chat if you haven't seen it. Now, there was lots and lots in that report, but I think the overriding message was one about the scale of the opportunity. We're really missing something big here by allowing this resource to sit idle. And these sites, there's sites that are blighting communities and harming well-being, but we could be using them for all sorts of things. They could be helping us to tackle inequality and fight climate change directly, from doing everything from growing food to building houses. But fortunately, the Scottish Government agrees with us about this. And at the end of last year, I think it was, they committed £50 million to a new 5-year investment programme. And that's designed specifically to bring some of these sites back into use. And we're going to have a really interesting session, I think tomorrow afternoon, looking at that fund and how people can apply for it. So if you want to hear more about that, then go ahead and get yourself signed up. So I suppose what I'm saying is, if we want to tackle inequality, the first thing we need to do is stop wasting resources and use them to actually create wealth in our most fragile communities. But the other thing I think we need to think about is how we actually tax existing wealth to help start redistributing it.
Okay, so that moves us on to tax, which is quite a popular topic, and the Commission has been doing a lot of work on tax lately. Do you think that land value tax can solve all of these problems?
Sort of. So we have been doing a lot of work on tax lately, and what that's shown us is there are really strong theoretical advantages of taxing land values. Those arguments are compelling. But the practical realities of doing it are complicated. And I think the issue with land value tax is it's often presented as a sort of simple solution, sometimes even as if it could be implemented as a single tax to replace all of the taxes. And that's simply not realistic. The reality is we live in a complex society, and there's always going to be a need for different tax instruments to do different things. But the underlying rationale for taxing land values is strong. And as I said earlier, if we want to build a wellbeing economy, we need to tackle wealth inequality. Land is a huge component of wealth, and tax is a powerful instrument for redistributing that wealth. So we do need to look seriously at the role of land and property taxation. So I suppose the short answer is yes, I think we do need to get better at taxing land values, but no, we're not likely to be advocating a single land value tax anytime soon. I think that's a useful thought experiment, but it's not a sensible policy proposal.
Okay, so can I just kind of check this with you? So it sounds like the answer isn't all about a land value tax, but a system that taxes land values more effectively. Is that right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah, that's exactly right, Posy. And we're going to be publishing the sort of findings of our work on this within the next couple of months. So if you're interested in that stuff, do keep an eye out on our website for more info.
Okay, so one thing we haven't talked about yet is the role of community ownership in this, in the wellbeing economy. How do you see it? How do you see community ownership aiding the transition to a wellbeing economy?
Yeah, so community ownership is going to play a really important role, I think. But what we do need to do, I think, is avoid giving the impression that it's always the answer, because I don't think it is. The reality is that outright community ownership is one option at the end of what could be a whole spectrum of different models. And sometimes it's going to be the right answer, often it is, but sometimes it won't. And what's really important it isn't necessarily, outright ownership. It's how the benefits from that ownership are shared. And that's really more a function of how land is governed rather than, who owns it. But governance is something we've been thinking about quite hard over the last couple of years. And it turns out that there's a whole range of potential models that we could be looking at to alongside community ownership that would enable communities to share in the benefits of land more fairly. And this is something, again, that my colleague James is going to be exploring in more detail at a session tomorrow afternoon. So if you are interested in that, and I'd really encourage you to sign up to that session and listen into what we've been up to.
Okay, so tying in with that, the other thing that we've heard a lot about lately is community wealth building. It's sort of talked about a lot in government and parliament. It's something that a lot of local authorities are looking at. So would you like to say a bit more about community wealth building?
Yeah, I think it's been really fascinating actually to watch the whole debate on community wealth building, because it's really taken off in the last year or so. And the reason it's fascinating is because in a lot of ways what it's done is sort of bring together a whole load of elements of good things that were already happening to one extent or another. And what it's done is it's brought them together, it's packaged them up, and it's given them a name. And I think that's actually really helpful, because previously we were all sort of talking in slightly different ways about this, using slightly different terminology to describe what I think is essentially similar things. And I think that made it hard for policymakers to really grapple with. Because I suppose whether your preferred term is community ownership or land reform, or community-led regeneration, or community wealth building, or community empowerment, or something else, actually, we're all talking about the same kind of thing. And now we've got a shared language to do it in. And I do think that makes it much easier for it to be supported at a policy level, because I think we're starting to see that now, because we're starting to see community-led delivery of whatever colour, whatever you call it. It's really starting to come into the mainstream now, in a way that it wasn't before. But whatever we call it, I think it's absolutely clear that land is going to be really, really vital to delivering it. Land is one of the 5 pillars of community wealth building, and in some ways, it's I would say this, but in some ways, it is the most important one, because it's the foundation for everything else, and it's the thing I think that ties the wealth bit of community wealth building back to well-being. And it does that through place. But if you want to know more about that relationship, I think this is going to be a really exciting area of work for us over the next few months. And if you want to know more about that relationship between land and community wealth building, we've got another session planned, I think, later this morning, looking at that. So I'd encourage you to sign up to that one as well.
Thanks, You're doing a good job at promoting all the conference sessions. Well, that was fascinating. And before I move over to the Q&A, and please do start submitting your questions through the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. Can I just ask you, Shona, to summarise everything that you've just said in a nice and easy sentence, please?
Just one sentence, is it, Posy? Okay, well, I'll have a go. So Scotland's approach to economics isn't delivering well at the moment for people or the planet. And if we want to change that, then we need to put land back at the heart of our economic model. And I think land reform is a vehicle that we can use to do that. Is that?
Yeah, that was good, thanks. Well, thank you for that really informative and thought-provoking discussion. I'd love to see what attendees think about that and think about what I've been talking about. So please do add your questions into the Q&A. There's been a couple coming through in the chat as well. One from Lindsay that's just sort of asking about where, as we're sort of touching on the topic that we talked about tax, and where tax grants should come in, so that if you do something good on your land, the tax would be reduced. What do you think about that, and sort of when you're in sort of the context about the taxation of land values?
Yes, I don't think I can see the question actually, but I think what it was, so what I picked up though is, can we use tax to incentivize people to behave better, to do good things with land? And I suppose the short answer is yes. And I'm not gonna sort of preempt what comes out of our review of tax by sort of giving you a whole load of examples, but I think the short answer is yes. And I think each of us could point to any one of a number of examples of how land isn't used very well at the moment, and think of sort of lots of ideas about how you might use the tax system to kind of incentivize better behaviour. And I suppose all I would say is that as part of the work that we've done on tax, we have looked at a number of those options and thought about, you know, sort of how practical they might be in reality. And yeah, I'm going to, a shameless plug for our work coming up is actually, if you want to find out what we've come up with, what we've decided on that, and keep an eye on our website. We'll be publishing the findings of that in a couple of months.
Okay, thanks. Well, there's a question come in from Gwen, who said that sort of around your talk around placemaking for wellbeing, sort of what policies are best placed to move this up the agenda and to make it happen on the ground, so both for public land and private?
Lots. That sounds slightly flippant, but it's actually true. And there was a huge amount in the work that we did on vacant and derelict land. So that, you know, it's not any one thing. But I guess a couple of things that I would highlight would be, I think local place plans have a huge potential to really tap in, I think, to the knowledge that's within local communities and the ability of the sort of latent ability of local communities to help drive that process. And I think the new vacant and derelict land investment fund that the government has created, I hope, should be a really important stimulus for making that happen. So that's one thing. The other thing, actually, I think that seems to have slipped down on the agenda a little bit lately, is compulsory sales orders. Now, the Land Commission made recommendations about compulsory sales orders a couple of years ago now. And I think actually they're going to be, or they should be, a really important part of the regeneration toolkit, the placemaking toolkit. Because what a compulsory sales order would do would be to provide a legal power for local authorities to compel owners to sell land if that land had been sitting unused for an undue period of time, and compel them to sell it at auction. And the at auction bit is actually quite important, because by using an auction, you're actually revealing the market price. So there's a couple of things.
Sort of building on that question around place, there's another one coming through from Eleanor about, can you sort of give some examples of what an effective place is that does benefit sort of well-being as well?
An effective how place benefits well-being. Yep. If I don't know if somebody in the background could maybe post a link to the case studies we published on vacant and derelict land last year, because that contained a whole load of case studies actually about how these kind of sites, these derelict sites of blighted communities, could be brought back into use in ways that really delivers for not just well-being but also climate change. So things like community growing, or I think there's an example in there about a kids adventure playground. There's stuff in there, what else is in there, about affordable housing, renewable energy generation, vertical growing. I think that's a really exciting opportunity. There are dozens and dozens of examples. And what's exciting about it actually is that since I suppose we started on this journey, actually we're really starting to see a lot of those projects starting to come to fruition. And Caroline Doherty, our vacant derelict land project manager who's working with DTAS at the moment, she spoke really well about this at a session yesterday. So there's some really exciting things going on and coming forward from communities already.
Thanks. There's a question in from Andy Whiteman, sort of referring to international experience and sort of the governance models across Europe. And I know that the Commission has done work on this and looked at sort of how other countries do it, and there sort of isn't quite such a distinction in other countries between sort of community ownership, public ownership, private ownership. And I just wondered if you could talk us through some of the work that the Commission's done on that and the experience, and actually the role of local authorities and how that sort of changes and the opportunities there for Scotland as well.
Yeah, but there's a lot in that. Yeah, so there's lots in that, isn't there? And yes, so we have done quite a lot of work looking at international experience over the last few years, and I suppose, and I think there are lots of places we could look to for inspiration. The most obvious one, I guess, would be Germany and the Netherlands, because they're already doing a lot of what we're talking about doing in terms of housing delivery. You know, it's quite normal in Germany and the Netherlands for the state to take a really proactive role in assembling sites and bringing them forward for development. I think the other place we could learn from actually is Switzerland, which has had quite a lot of success in sort of limiting greenfield development by taking a really active approach to reusing brownfield sites through its planning policy. So those are just two examples, but I think it's quite easy in a way for me to sort of sit here and point to those examples and say, that's how we should be doing things. But it's easy to forget that actually we need people to do these things. And I suppose what's happened over many years is that local authorities have been so cut down to the bone that the skills and the experience that you need to do these things actually very often they're not in local authorities anymore. So I think a big part of that actually, a big part of achieving this, it's not all about sort of policies, the regulation, the legislation that we put in place. Actually, it's about the people, and it's making sure that those people are resourced to do that properly. And that is about investing, I think, in our municipalities. I'm not sure if I actually answered Andy's question, but hopefully it touched on some of the themes.
Yeah, I think, and also sort of you did mention that there's going to be a session on tomorrow looking at sort of land governance models as well. Because in amongst sort of that question, Andy's also saying about, do we need stronger local government to democratise land governance?
Yeah, no, I think we definitely do, and I know James will cover this really well tomorrow. Because I think there is a big gap, isn't there? Scotland, we've got local authorities, but actually, the areas that some of our local authorities cover are so vast. I think the Highland Council itself covers an area, I think the size of Belgium. That's nuts. And elsewhere in Europe, local municipalities are much, much smaller, much more connected to the local community. And I think there is a real gap. I've heard it called a governance gap before, and I think that's a really good description. And in a lot of ways, I think a lot of what land reform is trying to do is actually trying to plug that governance gap.
And there's been sort of a couple of questions coming through talking about sort of the natural capital, a lot of the discussions that were happening yesterday, and just sort of about estimating the value of natural capital around sort of carbon credits, or depending on, again, it kind of links back to the productivity of land and sort of getting the value of that as well. How do you see sort of being able to get the best value from that land for everybody, and also actually sort of being able to kind of, there's obviously a lot of things happening outside of sort of carbon credits and the different codes, as well as our forestry and peat too, but how, and a lot of this is talked about in the public interest. So how do you see, I know that is a lot of it was discussed yesterday as well, but how do you see being able to truly make sure that the value of that is taken in the public interest, and then that therefore benefits the local and the wider economy?
Yeah, okay. So can I try and answer that question in two parts? I think the first bit of the question, and I think this relates directly to the question of value, and do we know what the value of carbon credits is, and that kind of thing. At the moment, no, I don't, and that's part of the problem. I think there's an awful lot of noise around this at the moment, and a lot of people getting worried by what they're reading, but actually there's a bit of a lack of data, so there is some data out there, but it's not sort of collated and it's not readily accessible. So I think part of what we need to do, and need to do quite rapidly, is get a better understanding of that data and of that value. I think there was a specific bit of that question though about what the value of nature is, and I think there was actually some work done on this a couple of years ago, I think now, by Nature Scott. So there is a report out there, and which we can probably share a link to, value in which actually put figures on, numbers on the value of nature. So that work is there and has been done. The other bit of the question though, I think, is more about how can we make sure that communities, and I use communities in the wide sense, not just local, but the community of Scotland, how can communities benefit from what's happening? And I think the answer to that, there's going to be various bits to the answer to that. I think part of it is going to be about regulating behaviour, and actually stepping in and working with land managers and investors to manage good practice. And I think the work that the Land Commission is doing through the land rights and responsibility statement, it's going to be a really important part of that. But I don't think it's going to be enough. I think we're also going to have to look quite seriously at a policy level to make sure that we've got the instruments, the mechanisms, the processes in place to make sure that those benefits are shared at a national level. And I think that's going to involve looking at things like, first of all, our own past experience. So, how we managed, or, some might say mismanaged oil, the lessons we can learn from our experience of renewables. There's already a community benefit mechanism there. And I think we also need to be looking overseas. And one thing I think I'm really interested in is the Norwegian experience, where Norway acted quite early in its sort of oil boom to set up a sovereign wealth fund. And I'm really interested in exploring that idea and what that might mean for Scotland and how we might manage our own natural resources in the future.
There's a question that's come in from Morag, which is touching back on the first questions around place and sort of place making. And Morag would like to know would making widespread use of local place plans help, and how could that be sort of facilitated quickly?
Short answer, yes. I think if I knew the answer to the second bit of that, the government would be giving me a big reward. So I don't know what the answer is in terms of facilitating it quickly. I think I can tell you what I think would help. I think what would help would be a whole series of, it's not even pilots, it's gone beyond that, exemplar projects, I suppose, in different communities across Scotland, where local communities could work directly with the local authority to develop a local place plan and work to deliver it. We did make the connection between local place plans and in our work on vacant and derelict land, and I really do think there's something in this idea of these small derelict sites within communities that could help us with, help us embed the whole local place plan idea. Because these are sites that they really do blight communities, they really cause real problems for well-being. So they're places that people can get excited about. And I think that's really important, because local place plans, if they're to work, I think they need to come from the ground up, they need to be driven by communities. And the only way that's going to happen is if people are getting excited about it.
Okay, so a lot of the conversation, all of the conversation today has been about how we can make sure that land is embedded in our economy. But how can you make sure that it's considered with equal impetus in our economy?
I think, I'm thinking about how to answer that question, because I think I've talked a lot over the last couple of years about the need to embed land in our economic model. And I think what I'm really getting at by that is the current frame of reference that we have for deciding when and how to intervene in the economy. It isn't really fit for purpose anymore, I don't think. So I think it needs updated. And I really do think that land reform can help us to do that. And what I mean by that is our current framework is really based all around about this sort of kind of fantasy idea of an ideal market, and the idea that if only we can maintain these ideal market conditions, then all's going to be well with the world. And it's the idea of market failure. And leading on from that, this notion that the proper role for the state is only to step in when those ideal market conditions are compromised, to correct market failure. But to achieve a well-being economy, I think we need to go beyond that. We need a whole new paradigm. And I'm not saying that land reform provides that paradigm, but I do think it can help us to get there. And the reason I say that is because the framework that land reform is being delivered through, the framework we're following, the land rights and responsibility statement, it addresses all of those kind of traditional market failure criteria, things around about transparency or diversity or good stewardship. All of that is part of the idea of market failure. So the land rights and responsibility statement, I think implementing it can help us to deliver an efficient market. But it goes well beyond that. I've mentioned 3 of the principles in the land rights and responsibility statement, but there's 6 of them. And I think the reason it helps us to go further is because it introduces broader notions about equity and about collaboration, building on some of the things I've spoken about today and some of the work that we've done already. And I think if we can build in those broader notions of equity and collaboration, that's going to be what the crucial difference is between moving us beyond where we are now to a model that actually really does prioritise well-being.
Thanks, Shona. There is a question from David Brown that's come into the Q&A as well. It kind of builds upon what you're saying about the land rights responsibilities, the collaboration and the behaviour. Is saying, are you satisfied that the Scottish Government will act adequately upon the Land Commission's work? And I think that sort of speaks about the culture change and the collaboration, as well as sort of legislative and policy development as well.
Yeah, I saw that one coming in and I wondered if you would ask me it. And I think the short answer's got to be yes, actually. And let's be fair to them. I think a lot of what we're saying, I'm glad that the question wasn't how quickly do you think the Scottish Government will act on what you've recommended, because I think a lot of what we have recommended is quite difficult. You know, we're talking about really big systemic change here, and that's not easy to implement, and it can't be done quickly. So yes, I am confident that they'll act on it, and I think there's good evidence actually of that, because I talked earlier about the vacant and derelict land work that we did, and we published, I think, back in October last year. And by December, the government had announced £50 million of funding. So I think the will is there to do it. I just think it is complicated. It does take time. So I suppose that all of us, myself included, needs to be a bit patient, I think.
Okay, well, thank you. And thanks everybody for your questions. It's been a really engaging discussion. If there's any questions or sort of any thing that you'd like to ask us, or after you've had a think about it following the session, then please do get in touch and email us at info@landcommission.gov.scot, and we'll try to get back to you as soon as possible. So, Shona, is there anything that you'd like to add, sort of to summarise or to kind of look ahead as well?
I couldn't even begin to summarise, don't think. But looking at the only thing I would say, looking ahead, actually, it's really exciting. There's some really exciting times coming up, and not just for the economy, and not just for Land Commission and land reform, but actually for the whole way we do economics.
Okay, that's great. Well, thanks very much, Shona, for your time today. And our theme of land and economy continues today, looking at the role of land in community wealth building in the next session, which starts at 11:30. So if you're interested for more information on how to register, visit the Land Commission's website. But thanks everyone for attending, and we hope you enjoyed it.